On a winter evening in his small-town living room, a tired, middle-aged father stood again with his retired search and rescue partner, a sturdy black and tan German Shepherd mix. Most nights he simply watched the fogged window while the truck keys lay untouched. Tonight the storm pressed harder. A local boy was late, and the dog paced to the glass, pawprints pointing toward the road and the keys in his hand. He stood at the wide, fogged living room window the way other men sat in front of a TV. Outside, the last of the winter light thinned over the quiet street, turning the ploughed snow along the driveway into low grey ridges. Inside, a single lamp on the end table painted his old flannel shirt in warm gold, while his breath left a faint cloud on the glass. Every evening it was the same corner of the carpet, the same soft sag in his knees, the same way his fingers curled lightly against the cold pane. The furnace hummed, the refrigerator clicked, and somewhere behind him a floorboard answered with a tired creak, as if another weight had shifted at exactly the same time he did. He tried not to look at the family photos on the wall to his left. 2 school portraits, 1 faded wedding picture, a candid shot of a boy with a fishing pole on the dock at the town lake. Instead, he watched the empty curve of the cul-de-sac, the little mailbox at the end of his drive, the faint halo of the nearest street lamp as dusk thickened. Something brushed his pant leg, just enough to make the fabric whisper. A soft exhale rose from somewhere near his hip, warm air moving in and out in an easy rhythm. He felt it more than heard it, the way you feel a presence in a room before you turn to see if anyone's there. The fine hair on his forearm reacted before his mind did. He told himself it was just the house settling whenever the faint tap-tap sounded near the baseboard. Old lumber, old nails, cold making the structure shift the way bones complained in winter. But the taps were too even, too measured, coming from the same spot on the hardwood between him and the front door, right on schedule with nightfall. The glass in front of him held more than his reflection. Near knee height, a cluster of ovals and half moons blurred the view, places where the fog refused to spread. He had wiped them clean yesterday, rubbing with the sleeve of his flannel until his shoulder ached. Yet here they were again, as though something inside or out kept touching the same small spots. A quiet weight leaned more firmly into his side, pressing him a fraction closer to the chilly pain. He could feel warmth soaking through his jeans, a living heat that made his tired lower back unclench a little. For a second, he imagined he was alone and losing his senses, because no one else lived here. Not since the kids grown and gone. Not since the hospital room that smelled of citrus wipes and final goodbyes. He stayed at the wide fogged living room window long after the porch light clicked on, staring past his own ghosted face at the darkening street. The creak in the floor, the measured taps, the warm weight at his side. The stubborn marks on the glass, they all fell into the same pattern. A nightly insistence he could not quite name. Something in this house, in this quiet, still expected a call, a return, a route to run. The next evening, the scene arranged itself again as if following stage directions. The lamp glowed, the cul-de-sac dimmed, and he drifted to the same worn spot by the wide, fogged living room window. Before he got there, he heard the faint rhythm on the floorboards, light taps, then a pause, then another cluster, like someone walking on tiptoe from the hallway to his side. A shape slid into his periphery, solid and familiar. A black and tan German Shepherd mix eased in beside him, heavier in the shoulders now, grey whispering along his muzzle. The animal's flank brushed his thigh with practiced certainty, as if this was simply where they both belonged when the day folded in. Tom Harris let his hand rest on the thick fur without thinking. Fog spread again across the glass, softening the view of the driveway and the single mailbox. Then it broke in the same place. The Shepherd mix lifted one paw and pressed it gently, deliberately, against the pane. When he pulled it back, the warmth left behind a clear oval, a print in the mist that stood out like a question mark. Tom swallowed against a sudden tightness in his chest. "Ranger, it's just the street," he murmured, though his voice sounded thin. The collar around the animal's neck gave a quiet jingle as he shifted his weight, nails clicking once against the wood. That little sound had yanked him out of sleep more nights than he could count, back when the radio on his nightstand still crackled with calls. He wiped at the glass with his sleeve again, watching the pawprints smear and vanish. The Shepherd mix ears tilted, tracking every motion, brown eyes flicking between Tom's face and the driveway. A moment later, the animal lifted his paw again, slightly higher this time, pressing a new print that lined up with the end of the drive, angled toward the road out of town. A draft slid down the window frame and brushed the side of Tom's neck, making him shiver. He told himself it was only age that made his heart skip when Ranger stared down the road like that. Habits took years to die, for man and animal both. "You're pacing because I used to," he said softly. "Old bones remember the rhythm. That's all." The Shepherd mix didn't pace, though he stood steady, muscles coiled but quiet, one shoulder leaning into Tom, his gaze fixed on that same stretch of asphalt. Outside, a car turned the far corner without slowing, taillights glowing, then disappeared. Inside, Ranger's breath fogged the glass again, paw print bright at the centre of it. By the time the street lamp fully bloomed and the last of the colour left the sky, there were several clear prints clustered on the pane, all at the same angle, all pointing outward. Tom's hand hovered over them, not quite touching. Why that road? Boy, he whispered. Throat rough. The only answer was a deeper sigh from the animal at his side, and another quiet jingle of metal as if to say the question was larger than words. He stepped back at last, knees aching, the warmth at his side following him faithfully. As he shut off the lamp, the wide fogged living room window became a dark mirror, his reflection faint beside the tall silhouette of the German Shepherd mix. The prints glowed faintly where the fog had cleared, small arrows in the glass pointing somewhere he had not yet dared to go. Before the house grew this quiet, Tom's nights had been carved up by radios and sirens instead of silence. Ranger had been younger then, a lean black and tan German Shepherd mixed with more black than grey. Restless energy coiled in every step. Tom could still feel the weight of the search and rescue harness in his hands, the worn webbing and the cold click of buckles in winter air. They'd trained on the town's edge, in fields crusted with frost and along the wooded trails near the lake. Tom remembered stumbling over roots in the dark, the beam of his headlamp bouncing, Ranger's collar jingling ahead of him as the animal quartered back and forth. Nose low, tail carving slow arcs. Those long nights had etched themselves into Tom's joints and into Ranger's bones. Calls came at ugly hours. A hiker overdue on the ridge trail. An elderly neighbour who wandered from the care home. A motorist whose car had spun into the ditch in freezing rain. Headlights half buried in snow. Each time, Ranger's ears would prick at the first crackle of the radio. His body lifting from the old rug by the heater before Tom was fully awake. He used to keep his boots under the wide, fogged living room window, back when it was just a plain pane of glass and not some altar to what-ifs. When the radio squawked, Tom would lurch for them, and Ranger would duck between him and the coffee table, nails clattering, already pushing toward the door. The prints in the morning frost on the porch always traced the same determined path to the truck. There had been one call that never settled right, the kind that people in small towns talked around for years rather than about. A teenager's car found empty at the bend by Miller's Creek. Driver's door open. No tracks leading away that anyone could trust in the storm. Tom and Ranger worked that search until their legs buckled. Ranger's paws raw beneath the snow packed into his fur. They found signs, but not the boy. Snow over snow. Footprints lost in the drift. Tom remembered the way Ranger had circled a stretch of creek bank, whining softly, refusing to leave it even when the sheriff called the teams back. Later, in the kitchen, Tom had stood with his hands pressed to the window, watching the headlights come and go as officials left, knowing some stories didn't get clean endings. After that winter, his son stopped calling as often. "You're always gone," the boy had said once over the phone, anger too big for his young frame. Tom had looked at Ranger, lying exhausted by the heater, and had no answer. He chose the calls because he couldn't not choose them. Somewhere in his chest, the responsibility felt wired into the same place his heartbeat lived. Years piled up. The department got younger handlers, fresher dogs with new certifications. Tom's knees complained louder on steep hills, and Ranger's grey spread across his muzzle. The last mission on the books for their team ended with a found safe, and the chief had clapped Tom on the shoulder, saying it was a good one to go out on. Retirement papers slid across a desk that smelled faintly of coffee and dust. When he moved Ranger's bed from the corner near the back door to the spot by the wide fogged living room window, it felt like a small betrayal and a mercy at the same time. No more radios at 2 a.m. No more harness buckles. Still, almost out of habit, Tom found himself standing at the glass at the old call-out hours, hand on the cold pane, as Rangers, breathing, rose and fell at his side, as if their bodies hadn't quite gotten the message that they were off duty. It was a Tuesday when Tom first noticed the angle. Not just that Ranger was making prints on the glass again, but the way those marks lined up with something beyond the porch. Dusk rested low over the neighborhood, roofs holding the last light like old hands cupping embers. When Ranger stepped forward from his place on the floor and lifted his paw to the wide fogged living room window, the print landed higher this time, a clear oval in the breath frost. Tom followed the line of it with his eyes, through the glass and across the yard. It seemed to point directly at the little mailbox, then on toward the curve of the road where Miller's Creek lay 2 miles away. His chest tightened, a muscle memory of that long-ago winter night flaring bright and unwelcome. "Stop that," he muttered, rubbing his thumb over the print. The glass squeaked. The marks smeared. But Ranger's attention didn't waver. The black and tan German Shepherd mix shifted his weight, nails clicking on the wood like a shy knock, then lifted his paw again. Another print appeared, a little higher, the two of them forming the beginning of a crooked line angled outward. Tom's heartbeat thudded in his ears. For a moment, he felt foolish, a grown man reading meaning into smudges on glass. He had told himself for months that Ranger's restlessness was just habit, a body trained too long to expect the world to need him. Yet here was that same body tracing an invisible arrow toward a road Tom had tried not to think about. The collar jangled as Ranger turned away abruptly and trotted down the hall. Tom watched him vanish, then heard the soft scrape of teeth on leather. A moment later, the animal returned with an old key ring dangling from his mouth. The truck keys, dull and scarred, still clipped to it. Ranger nudged Tom's hand with them, then looked back at the window. Tom's throat went dry. He hadn't driven to the creek bend in years, not since the search teams had finally stopped sweeping it on anniversaries. He felt the weight of the keys and the weight of his own hesitation, layered together like sediment behind his ribs. Something fluttered that felt too active to be dismissed as age. "We're retired. Remember," he whispered, but the words tasted thin. Ranger sat down with a soft huff, tail thumping once against the baseboard. The sound vibrated faintly through Tom's calves. Outside, a distant siren rose and fell. Not frantic, just the standard call heading somewhere else in town. Ranger's ears twitched toward it, then back to Tom's face, eyes dark and steady, waiting for a decision that wasn't on any official dispatch. That night, Tom didn't put the truck keys back in their drawer. He left them on the small table under the lamp, next to the framed photo of his son holding a fish. Both of them younger, weathered by sun instead of worry. As he went to bed, the soft click of Ranger's nails followed him, more measured now, as if some message had been delivered between them, even if Tom couldn't yet translate it into words. He lay awake longer than usual, listening to the house breathe and the winter wind test the edges of the siding. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the prints on the wide, fogged living room window, not as random smears, but as marks laid down with intention. The thought that Ranger might be trying to tell him something real, something specific, settled into him like a seed waiting for its chance to root. The storm rolled in on a Friday, thick clouds muscling over the town by late afternoon, dimming the light until the street lamps flicked on early. By supper, sleet had turned to wet snow, heavy and clinging, muffling the usual sounds of the neighborhood. Tom stood at the sink, rinsing his plate, when his landline rang, a jarring noise in a life mostly reduced to quiet. It was Mrs. Garner from 3 houses down, her voice tight, riding the edge of panic. Her grandson hadn't come home from his shift at the grocery store on the edge of town. He was old enough to drive, responsible, not the type to vanish without a word. His car should have been back an hour ago. The roads were getting slick. "I didn't want to bother anyone," she said. I thought maybe you'd know what to do." Tom felt the old circuitry in his mind flick on, rusty but intact. As he spoke to her calm questions about routes, about which jacket had been wearing, he heard the soft clatter of nails behind him. Ranger had risen from his place by the heater without being called. The black and tan German Shepherd mix moved to the wide fogged living room window, breath already clouding the glass. When Tom hung up, his pulse thrummed in his neck. The radio on the shelf by the couch was technically still tuned to the county frequency, but he hadn't touched it in months. Now he flicked it on, listening for dispatch updates. A couple of accidents reported near the highway. A slide-off out by the ridge. Responders called. Units assigned. No mention of Mrs. Garner's grandson. There were too many miles of road and not enough eyes. Ranger lifted his paw and pressed it against the fogged pane. Then again, lower, then higher, until a line of prints formed, angling toward the driveway and beyond. Tom stepped closer, feeling the cold seeping through his flannel, the faint tremor in his own fingers. The prints, laid one after another, resembled a crude arrow, the kind a child might draw, pointing toward the curve where the road dipped toward Miller's Creek and the grocery store sat just beyond. "You don't know that," Tom muttered, voice catching. He wanted to believe Ranger's instincts were just muscle memory, that this was nothing more than an old habit firing under stress. The shepherd mix leaned harder into him, nails scratching lightly at the sill. A small, insistent sound. Outside, snowflakes spun in the beam of the street lamp like static, obscuring the view. The phone rang again. This time it was the volunteer fire captain. Younger voice, brisk with the fatigue of too many calls on a bad night. They were stretched thin, he said. A couple crews were already out on the main roads. They'd keep an eye out for the boy's car. But the back ways, those narrow routes locals use to cut around traffic, would have to wait until resources freed up. The captain's tone held apology and hard limits in equal measure. Tom hung up slowly. The house felt smaller, the air thicker. His heart beat too loud for the quiet room, matching the ramped-up rhythm of Ranger's breathing. The German shepherd mix made a low sound in his throat, not a bark, more like a question pressed into the space between them. His paw slid down the glass, then rose again, marking the same path outward as if Head drawn it on a map only he could read. A familiar war raged inside Tom. He had promised himself, his late wife, and his son over the years that he was done with the dangerous parts, that Head let younger legs take the risks. His knees weren't what they used to be. Neither were Ranger's. But the idea of sitting in his chair, letting snow pile up while a boy he knew drove somewhere in the dark alone, twisted his gut until he felt slightly sick. He picked up the truck keys from the table, their weight cool and solid in his palm. Ranger's ears snapped forward at the sound. Collar chiming. Tom hesitated one last time, feeling every year, every ache, every old failure pressing against his ribs. Then he slipped on his heavy coat, his boots, and opened the door. Cold rushed in, shocking and bracing. "All right, partner," he said quietly. "One drive, just to look." Ranger moved ahead, not bounding, but with a steady, purposeful gait, nails clicking on the porch wood then crunching on the snow-dusted steps. As Tom locked the door behind him, he glanced back once. Through the wide, fogged living room window, the line of pawprints head left on the inside still shone faintly, a ghostly arrow pointing him out into the storm, toward a choice head spent years trying not to make again. The truck's engine complained as it turned over, then settled into a rough idle. Snow slapped against the windshield in heavy, wet sheets. Tom flicked the wipers on high and pulled away from the curb, the tires spitting slush. Ranger sat upright in the passenger seat, harnessless but alert, the black and tan German Shepherd mix bracing himself against every turn as if Head never left this job. They drove slowly, headlights struggling against the white blur. Radio chatter crackled softly from the dash, distant voices coordinating responses on other roads. Tom kept one hand tight on the wheel, the other hovering near the old handheld radio head thrown onto the console out of habit. "We'll check the usual way first," he said, more to himself than to Ranger, voice steadying as he spoke. At the first intersection, logic suggested turning left, taking the newer, wider route toward the store. Ranger's entire body leaned right instead, gaze locked on the narrower road that dipped past Miller's Creek. A soft whine slipped out, followed by a quick glance at Tom's face, then back to the snow-choked asphalt. Years of searches lay behind that gaze. Tom felt them all in the space of a heartbeat. The steering wheel felt very large in his hands as he blinked against the sting in his eyes. "Fine," he muttered, turning right. The truck's rear slid a little before finding traction. Ranger's tail thumped once against the seat, then went still, posture focused. The road narrowed, white banks rising on either side. In the sweep of the headlights, Tom caught glimpses of the creek, dark and swollen, running parallel. A quarter-mile in, the first sign came into view, tire tracks carving uneven scars in the fresh snow, veering toward the shoulder. Tom's breath hitched. He slowed, following the lines with his eyes until they disappeared over a small embankment where the guardrail ended near a clump of saplings. Ranger's nails scraped against the floorboard. Urgent, now. A scratch, scratch, scratch that demanded action. Tom pulled over carefully, tires grinding to a stop. The radio on the dash buzzed with some other call, but he barely heard it. Wind shoved against the truck as he opened the door, sleet slapping his face, cutting through his coat. Ranger leapt down beside him, landing heavier than in his youth but still sure-footed, and immediately trotted toward the break in the snowbank where the tracks vanished. They scrambled down the short slope together, Ranger slightly ahead, nose working the air. At the bottom, the beam of Tom's flashlight found what the headlights couldn't. the back end of a small car jammed against a tangle of brush, front half nose down toward the creek, one wheel still lazily spinning. The driver's door was crumpled, but mostly intact, the window frosted from the inside. Tom's heart pounded so hard it almost drowned out the rush of the creek. "Garner," he shouted, voice cracking. The name felt too much like that other winter, that other boy. For a second, the world narrowed snow, water, metal, his own ragged breath. Then Ranger barked, sharp and controlled, the sound ricocheting off the snowbanks like a flare. A movement answered from inside the car, small but definite. Tom scrambled closer, boots slipping, hands scraping cold metal. Through the fogged side window he saw a pale face, eyes wide, a hand pressed weakly against the glass. The boy was conscious but pinned by the angle, frightened and shivering. No blood, no gaping wounds, just a tangle of limbs and fear. Relief and terror collided in Tom's chest. Training clicked into place, automatic despite the years. He spoke in calm, measured tones, the same phrases Head used with stranded hikers, with elderly wanderers lost in their own streets. He radioed for assistance with clipped clarity, voice steadier than he felt, giving mile markers and landmarks. Ranger stayed at the door, front paws on the sill, nose pressed to the fogged glass, anchoring the boy with his presence. Minutes stretched, but helped by adrenaline and old know-how, Tom managed to wedge open the passenger side enough to reach in, bracing the boy's shoulders, keeping him talking. Sirens approached in the distance, growing louder. Ranger shifted only to give Tom space, then settled himself where the boy could still see him. Eyes soft but intent, body a solid promise that he was not alone. Later, after paramedics had taken over and the boy was wrapped in blankets on the roadside, mumbling apologies and gratitude, the fire captain clapped Tom's shoulder through layers of wet fabric. "Good thing you checked this way," he said. We'd have missed him for another hour at least. Tom only nodded, throat too tight to answer. Ranger leaned against his leg, trembling slightly. Snow crusted in his fur, but eyes still scanning, still on duty. When they finally pulled back into the driveway, the storm had eased to a quiet, sifting snow. Tom killed the engine and sat for a moment, listening to it tick as it cooled. His whole body ached, but a different kind of heaviness had lifted from his chest, one he hadn't known how to name until it shifted. He looked at Ranger, who looked back, and in the dog's tired, steady gaze, he saw not just tonight's rescue, but the ghost of a winter where they'd been too late. Tonight, The Pawprints had pointed them home instead of to regret. Inside, as he hung up his coat, he caught sight of the wide fogged living room window. Even from the doorway, he could see fresh prints at the lower edge, a little line of ovals head barely registered on his way out. They were angled toward the road they'd just returned from, as if the glass had been holding the map all along. Tom walked over, laid his hand beside them, and let his forehead rest against the cool pane, breathing out a long, shaking sigh that felt like it had waited years to be released. The storm passed, leaving behind a town hushed under clean snow and a set of news stories passed between neighbours over coffee and at the diner counter. Mrs. Garner's grandson came by a few days later, arm in a sling but otherwise whole, cheeks flushing when he thanked Tom and stooped to scratch Ranger's ears. The black and tan German Shepherd mix leaned into the touch, accepting it with the quiet dignity of one who'd simply done his work. Life didn't transform overnight, but something in the house's rhythm shifted. Tom still stood at the wide fogged living room window most evenings, but the heaviness in his shoulders had eased. Ranger still padded over at dusk, nails ticking on the hardwood, taking his place at Tom's side. The Pawprints appeared on the glass, but now Tom watched them with a different understanding, like reading handwriting he'd finally learned to decode. Sometimes the prints pointed toward the cul-de-sac, toward Mrs. Garner's porch, where a new porch light now burned a little brighter. Sometimes they angled toward the ridge road, where the volunteer crew's truck passed less frantically these days. On quieter nights, they seemed to point simply at the mailbox, at the humble fact of home, at the path any weary person might walk to find someone waiting on the other side of the door. Tom found himself talking more, not just to Ranger, but to the people whose paths crossed his. At the grocery store, he offered to help an exhausted young mother load her car during a cold rain. On the sidewalk, he lingered to chat with the mail carrier about the weather, about the new sidewalks the town had promised. Ranger trotted beside him, gentle with older neighbours, shoulder brushing Tom's leg like a steadying hand. One afternoon, his son called out of the blue. The conversation was stiff at first, words scraping against old silences. Then the younger man asked about the storm, about the rescue he'd heard mentioned on a community page. Tom found himself telling the story, not as a tale of heroics, but as one of listening to instinct, to an old partner who still saw what he sometimes tried to ignore. On the other end of the line, his son was quiet in a way that felt less like distance and more like respect. Seasons turned. In spring, rain streaked the wide living room window instead of frost, and Ranger's pawprints mingled with drops, the shapes blurring together. In summer, the glass fogged less, but on humid evenings, Tom could still make out faint ovals where warm fur and warm breath touched the pane. They walked later then, down to the corner and back, fireflies winking in the yards, Ranger's collar chiming softly in the twilight. By autumn, a new ritual had settled in. After supper, Tom would wash the dishes, hang the towel over the oven handle to dry, then tap the counter twice. Ranger would rise from the rug by the heater thinner now, but still his favourite spot, and join him at the window. Together they'd watch the leaves skitter across the street, the town's lights twinkling on one by one, their reflections overlapping in the glass with the smudged, familiar marks of a paw that knew where home was and insisted gently on showing him. Years have a way of softening even the sharpest edges, rounding them into something a person can hold without flinching. Tom's hair thinned and went almost entirely white. Ranger's muzzle turned silver, his step slower, joints creaking enough that Tom laid an extra folded blanket beside the old rug by the heater. Yet every evening, when the light outside shifted from gold to blue, the same quiet pull brought them both toward the wide fogged living room window. The town changed in small ways, new paint on old storefronts, a coffee shop where the hardware store used to be, a fresh coat of asphalt on the road by Miller's Creek. Young families moved into houses that had once held neighbours Tom had known for decades. They waved when they walked past and pointed out the shepherd mix in the window to their children, who pressed mittened hands to the glass when invited in, delighted when Ranger's pawprints appeared beside their own. Inside, the routines were simple. Tom brewed his evening tea, the steam curling around his face as he carried the mug to the window. Ranger rose more slowly now, but still came, leaning into Tom's leg the way he always had, their combined reflection a little shorter, a little stooped, but steady. The paw, when lifted to the glass, left a print that was more faint than before, but to Tom it seemed deeper somehow, as if time had pressed meaning into it. He caught himself, now and then, telling the story of the night in the storm. Sometimes it was to the young fire captain over coffee at the station, where he and Ranger would drop in carrying a tin of cookies. Sometimes it was to Mrs. Garner's grandson, now grown. How'd stop by on holidays and stand at the window with them for a moment, hand resting on Ranger's back. Each telling felt less like reliving an emergency and more like passing along a reminder. Listen to the quiet nudges. They might be pointing someone home. On a winter evening, years after that rescue, snow sifted down again outside. Gentler this time. Tom stood in his familiar spot, flannel shirt soft from countless washings, tea warming his hands. Ranger leaned against him, breathing slow and even. The glass fogged, and the old paw lifted once more, leaving a soft-edged print beside the faint traces of many others. Tom laid his hand next to it, fingers spread, palm warm. The prints on the window, The worn rug by the heater, the steady presence at his side, all of it told the same quiet truth. Neither of them was on duty in the old way anymore. But in this house, on this little stretch of road, they had already brought each other home. If this story touched your heart, drop a simple 1 in the comments to let us know you were here. Your support keeps these gentle stories alive. Don't forget to subscribe and stay with us, because the next story might just be the one that finds you when you least expect it.